On November 12, 1942, in Richmond, California, a full-size cargo ship, 441 feet long and nearly 28.5 million pounds, was ready to launch into San Francisco Bay from the Permanente Metals Corporation's second yard. What made this moment historic was the speed. The entire ship had been built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. For comparison, traditional shipyards had taken 6 to 8 months to build vessels of that size, a pace that hadn't changed much since the American Revolution. Yet here stood a finished Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, ready for duty. Over 1,000 workers stepped back from the ship, not veteran shipbuilders, but people from all walks of life. Former secretaries, farmers, homemakers, and laborers had all learned how to weld just weeks before. That day, a crowd of officials, reporters, and rival shipyard leaders gathered to witness what would become a turning point in industrial production. This moment wasn't just about one ship. It was the start of a massive shift in how things were made in America. It signaled a new kind of production model that would change manufacturing for decades to come. The Allies' strength in World War II wouldn't just come from strategy, but from industrial output that broke all the old rules about how long shipbuilding could take and what factories could do. The change had started back on December 27, 1940, when Henry J. Kaiser signed his first shipbuilding contract. At that point, Kaiser had never built a ship or run a shipyard. His background was in large construction projects like dams across the western U.S. But now, at age 58, he told the U.S. Maritime Commission he'd deliver 30 cargo ships for Britain within 2 years. Experienced shipbuilders didn't take him seriously. At Todd Bath Iron Works, one of the country's oldest yards, they agreed to work with him, expecting they'd have to make up for his lack of knowledge. But what they didn't realize was that Kaiser's outsider status would actually be his greatest strength. Watching all this was William Francis Gibbs, America's top naval architect. His firm, Gibbs and Cox, had designed the Liberty ships based on British models, and he had far more experience with ships than Kaiser did. The journey from doubt to innovation started in early 1941, when Kaiser and his team began reviewing traditional shipbuilding at Todd's offices in New York. It didn't take long to realize the old methods simply weren't fast enough to meet the demands of war. Kaiser's chief engineer, Clay Bedford, had recently visited a Ford factory in Detroit. He saw cars being built on moving assembly lines, with workers adding parts at each stop. That visit convinced him the same system could work for ships. But the idea sounded ridiculous to the traditional builders. The first major shock came when Kaiser suggested getting rid of riveting altogether. Riveting, the old-school method of hammering heated metal pins into steel plates, was time-consuming and labor-intensive. A skilled crew could maybe do 100 rivets a day, and each Liberty ship needed about 1 million. Instead, Kaiser proposed using electric arc welding, a process he'd already mastered while building pipelines. At the time, the idea was controversial. Vice Admiral Emory Land, head of the Maritime Commission, was highly skeptical. Letters he wrote, now kept in the National Archives, showed how unsure the maritime establishment was. Welding hadn't been proven on this scale, and the British Navy didn't even allow it on their warships. Land questioned whether it was worth risking America's supply lines on something untested. Still, the situation was urgent. German submarines and warships were sinking Allied cargo vessels faster than they could be replaced. In 1941 alone, about 3.6 million tons of Allied shipping was lost. Britain was struggling to survive, and American yards using standard building methods needed around 230 days to finish a single ship. At that rate, the Allies had no chance of winning the fight for control of the Atlantic. So when Kaiser's contract was approved, it wasn't because the government had full confidence in him. It was because they had no other choice. Between January and December of 1941, what used to be empty mudflats in Richmond, California, turned into a full-blown shipyard. Kaiser's crews, who had more experience with dams and highways than ships, built a facility that looked nothing like the traditional shipyards. Instead of the usual towering cranes and long, narrow building platforms, Richmond was designed more like a car factory. Wide open spaces were used to pre-build parts of ships, and 7 short, side-by-side building lanes were laid out for final assembly. Steel sections, some weighing up to 150 tons, were moved around the site on a web of rail lines, and heavy-duty cranes were set up every 100 feet to lift entire parts into place. When John Riley, a senior naval architect from Bethlehem Steel with 30 years in the business, visited in May 1941, he didn't hold back in his confidential review. He criticized Kaiser's layout as breaking every rule of good shipyard design he knew. The pre-assembly areas were too big, the cranes were more powerful than necessary, and the building lanes were too short. But even he had to admit it was all built for one thing: fast ship production. Then came the workers, the next major shift. Traditional shipyards hired from tight-knit coastal communities where skills were passed down through generations. Kaiser took a different route. He ran newspaper ads nationwide, offering pay 20% higher than usual factory jobs and guaranteed training to anyone willing to learn. The first wave of workers arrived in August 1941. Most had zero shipyard experience, but Kaiser wasn't worried. He broke complex tasks down into basic steps that could be taught quickly, just like on an assembly line. By October, over 10,000 people were working at the Richmond yard, and fewer than 200 had any background in shipbuilding. In traditional programs, welders spent 4 years learning their craft. Kaiser's team trained people in 2 weeks to do just one specific task, like welding vertical seams, deck joints, or curve panels. They did those jobs over and over again until they were fast and accurate. As 1941 turned into 1942, something surprising started to happen. The time it took to build a Liberty ship kept dropping. The first ship took 197 days to finish. The second one took 169. The fifth was done in 128 days. By the 10th, it was down to 97 days. By spring of 1942, they were rolling out completed ships in an average of 70 days each. Meanwhile, traditional shipyards were starting to feel the heat. Kaiser's so-called unskilled labor force was suddenly matching, and in some cases outpacing, the seasoned crews in older yards. The method they had all dismissed was now proving could work. Kaiser's secret was building ship sections at the same time in different parts of the yard. Instead of building one ship from the bottom up, he had teams working on different parts all at once: the bow, the stern, the engine room, and the upper decks. Once each part was done, cranes lifted the giant sections into place, and welders connected everything. Albert Wooding, who supervised production at Yard No. 2, explained how this worked in a 1943 interview with Fortune magazine. In the old way, you couldn't install the engine until the hull and engine room were finished. Everything had to happen one step at a time. Kaiser's method let crews build the engine in one place and the engine room in another. When both were ready, they simply dropped the engine into place and welded it in. Jobs that used to take weeks now only took hours. The numbers were hard to ignore. A typical shipyard might use 50 workers over 3 weeks to install an engine inside a cramped, half-built room. Kaiser's method used 200 workers to build the entire engine and its support structure in a wide-open workshop in just 5 days. Then cranes moved the whole assembly into place in an 8-hour shift. What really shocked traditional shipbuilders wasn't just the speed. It was how Kaiser casually tossed out practices that had been followed for centuries. Ship construction had always been done using detailed, precise plans where every part was laid out in advance. Kaiser didn't stick to that. He used basic, simplified drawings that gave general measurements and left the rest to workers' judgment. To longtime builders, this seemed careless. Kaiser saw as practical. One of his strongest critics was Vice Admiral Howard Vickery, a career Navy officer and vice chairman of the Maritime Commission. At first, he strongly objected to Kaiser's idea of cutting back on detailed blueprints. He believed shipbuilding, unlike car manufacturing, required exactness. But that view didn't hold for long. Meeting notes from early 1942 show how Vickery changed his mind. In January, he argued against letting Kaiser simplify specifications. But by March, Kaiser's yard were turning out ships 40% faster than traditional ones. By June, the gap had grown to 70%. Vickery admitted something important. Chasing perfection was slowing everyone down. Kaiser's ships weren't pretty, but they worked, and they delivered cargo while other ships were still being built. As production picked up through spring and summer 1942, a rivalry started among the 7 shipyards Kaiser operated across California, Oregon, and Washington. Edgar Kaiser, Henry's son and the company's vice president, managed operations, especially in the Pacific Northwest, and oversaw the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation in Portland. Meanwhile, Clay Bedford led the charge at the Richmond yards. Both were driven and competitive, and they ended up in a friendly race to see whose yard could build ships faster. That unofficial contest between Portland and Richmond became a bit of a media event by fall 1942, with newspapers reporting progress like sports scores. Records kept falling, until the Oregon yard set a stunning new mark in September 1942 by finishing the Joseph N. Teal in just 10 days. Eventually, Vice Admiral Vickery put an end to the race, calling it a distraction from the real work. But the competition had done what Kaiser wanted. Now, everyone across all his yards believed that building ships fast wasn't just possible. It was a new standard. Then, in November 1942, came the biggest test yet. While touring the Richmond facility, Vice Admiral Emory Land casually told reporters that, while shipbuilding had come a long way, it still hadn't matched the speed of other industries using mass production. Clay Bedford overheard the comment and took it personally. He approached Land and said Richmond Yard No. 2 would try to build an entire Liberty ship from the ground up in less than 10 days. That would cut the Joseph N. Teal's record in half. Land agreed, as long as it didn't interfere with normal operations. Bedford picked the 47th hull scheduled for Yard No. 2. The ship will be named the SS Robert E. Peary, in honor of the Arctic explorer. At exactly 1 minute past midnight on Sunday, November 8th, more than 1,000 workers began round-the-clock shifts to attempt something no one had ever done before. Thanks to the prefabrication system, nearly every part of the ship was already built, inspected, and staged before work began on the keel. The bow section, made from over 50 individual parts, was already fully welded and equipped with anchor systems, crew quarters, and storage before construction even started. The stern came ready with steering gear, a mounted propeller shaft, and living spaces for the rear crew. 4 cargo holds, each weighing tens of tons, had been built separately and were ready to be dropped into place. The ship's engine, a 140-ton triple expansion steam unit built by Joshua Hendy Iron Works in Sunnyvale, had already been installed on its frame, tested, and shipped in one piece. While older shipyards were still working through one layer at a time, Kaiser's team was snapping pre-built sections together like a puzzle. For days after the project began, the hull was finished. The engine was in place. The upper structures were set. The cargo holds were locked in, and the steering gear was already mounted. On Thursday, November 12th at 3:30 p.m., just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after construction began, the SS Robert E. Peary was launched into San Francisco Bay. The ship was officially completed and ready for service by November 15th, setting a new record: 7 days, 14 hours, and 32 minutes from start to finish. The launch drew a big crowd, including military leaders, shipbuilding experts, competitors, and journalists from across the country. Many showed up expecting to see a rush job or ship that wasn't truly finished. Instead, they saw a fully functional vessel that only needed a few final touches before heading out to serve. Vice Admiral Emory Land was there and made a short speech, captured on newsreel film. His words marked a major shift in thinking. 6 months ago, I would have said this couldn't be done. Everything we thought we knew about shipbuilding told us you couldn't build a real ship in 5 days. But Henry Kaiser has proven us wrong. From now on, every shipyard under contract with the U.S. Maritime Commission will be expected to use these methods. This moment hit the traditional shipbuilding world hard. Just a year and a half earlier, many had brushed off Kaiser as an outsider who didn't understand the industry. Now, those same builders were sending teams to study how he'd done it. In December 1942, the president of New York Shipbuilding, one of the oldest and most respected shipyards in the country, visited Richmond. His private report to his board said everything had changed. He wrote that Kaiser had done what the rest of the industry thought was impossible, not by following old rules, but by ignoring them. Kaiser treated shipbuilding as a manufacturing job, not a slow, handcrafted tradition. He simplified what others tried to perfect. He standardized what others custom-built. He trained people with no experience to do skilled jobs, and it worked. His yards built ships in 1/10 the time and for about 2/3 the cost. The report ended with a clear message: either change or get left behind. By early 1943, the impact of Kaiser's methods was being felt nationwide. Across the U.S., 18 shipyards were now building Liberty ships using prefabrication and welding. Average build time had dropped from 230 days to just 42 by the middle of the year. The U.S. was now launching 3 Liberty ships every single day, faster than enemy submarines could destroy them. But it wasn't just the numbers that shook up the industry. It was who was building the ships. Tens of thousands of workers, including women, people of color, and those with no prior experience, were now doing jobs once reserved for a small group of trained craftsmen. The old, exclusive system of passing down shipbuilding skills through generations was being dismantled. At the peak of production in 1944, Kaiser's 7 shipyards employed around 196,000 people. Over 40,000 of them were women, a massive shift for an industry that had been almost entirely male. By mid-1944, women made up 27% of the workforce at the Richmond yards. In the Northwest alone, Kaiser employed more than 31,000 women by that year. African American workers also held tens of thousands of positions, not just in support roles, but in skilled trades like welding and fitting, crane operation, and even management. This level of inclusion was rare in 1940s America and marked a major step toward workplace integration. Kaiser's approach to work had lasting effects. He showed that complex industrial tasks didn't need to be passed down over generations. They could be taught, and that anyone, given the right training and support, could build something that mattered. One final example stood out during the 1943 holiday season. While traditional yards closed for a few days at Christmas, Kaiser's operations kept going, but not without care for his workers. Instead of just requiring people to work to the holiday, his teams organized full Christmas dinners in the company cafeterias. On-shift workers were treated to turkey, ham, and all the classic holiday fixings at no cost as a way to thank them for their commitment. Local churches sent carolers, and the Richmond Municipal Band performed for workers. Even Henry Kaiser himself showed up, walking the yards, shaking hands, and personally thanking crews for their work. By the middle of 1944, Kaiser's 7 shipyards had produced over 800 Liberty ships. But the reach of his ideas went far beyond his own operations. Across 18 U.S. shipyards, Liberty ship production had passed 2,400 vessels. Then came Victory ships, bigger and faster, which were also built using the same prefabrication and welding methods. From 1941 to 1945, the U.S. produced more than 5,500 ships, totaling about 53 million tons of cargo capacity. Even by today's standards, that scale is hard to believe. Commander Joseph Kenworthy of the Royal Navy, working with the British Admiralty in Washington, watched this output with both admiration and concern. In reports that were declassified decades later, he admitted what many others were thinking. The U.S. was producing ships faster than the rest of the world combined. Kaiser alone, he noted, was turning out more shipping tonnage every month than the entire British shipbuilding industry. The American techniques, he said, were rough by British standards. The ships weren't elegant, but they floated, they hauled cargo, and there were thousands of them. Where the Royal Navy built the finest warships in the world, the Americans built good enough ships by the thousands. And that, he wrote, was more powerful than a handful of perfect vessels. But perhaps the most unexpected part of the story came after the war ended. Many experts predicted a sharp collapse in the shipbuilding industry, with layoffs and abandoned facilities. And to some extent, they were right. Liberty ship production stopped in September 1945. By the end of that year, Kaiser's workforce had dropped from 200,000 to fewer than 20,000. The once bustling Richmond yards, which had employed 100,000 people at their peak, were nearly empty by spring 1946. Still, the ideas that powered those yards didn't disappear. The techniques Kaiser developed, prefabrication, welding, parallel assembly, became the new global standard. In the 1950s and 60s, countries like Japan and South Korea looked to Kaiser's Liberty ship program as a blueprint. As they rebuilt their shipping industries, they copied his methods and used them to power up their own economies. The massive shipyards in Ulsan, South Korea, and Nagasaki, Japan, now among the world's largest, directly evolved from the methods pioneered in Richmond. John Bunker, a maritime historian from SUNY Maritime College, summed it up well in a major study published in 1972. He wrote that Kaiser entered shipbuilding with no experience, no ties to maritime tradition, and no concern for doing things the usual way. He applied mass production strategies that the industry had once dismissed as completely wrong for shipbuilding. In just 3 years, he built more ships than had been produced in the United States over the entire previous century. Even more important than the numbers, Kaiser changed how ships would be built for the rest of the 20th century. Today's global shipyards, whether they're producing container ships in Korea, tankers in Japan, or cruise liners in Europe, all use construction methods rooted in Kaiser's Liberty ship program. Prefabricated modules, welded structures, and parallel assembly are now standard. The scale of Kaiser's impact is clear in the final numbers. From 1941 to 1945, American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships across 18 sites. At peak speed, that worked out to nearly 2 ships per day. Kaiser's own yards were responsible for 1,490 of them, over a quarter of the entire U.S. wartime merchant fleet built under government contracts. By Thursday afternoon, November 12th, the SS Robert E. Peary had officially broken every speed record, taking just 4 days and 15 hours from the start construction to launch. That kind of progress reflected a massive jump in efficiency across the board. Back in 1941, the first Liberty ships took about 230 days to build. By 1943, the average had dropped to just 42 days. Labor hours fell too, from around 1.1 million hours per ship down to 486,000. At Kaiser's best-performing yards, like Richmond Yards 2 and 3, the number was even lower, as few as 350,000 labor hours per vessel. Thanks to non-stop 3-shift schedules and advanced prefabrication, costs followed a similar trend. Early Liberty ships cost between $1.75 and $2 million each. But by 1943, even with rising wages and materials, the average dropped to around $1.8 million. Proof that the learning curve and streamlined systems were paying off. Each Liberty ship could carry a full load of 14,245 tons. In one trip, a single ship could transport roughly 10,800 tons of cargo, enough to move 2,840 jeeps for 140 tanks or 230 million rounds of ammunition. They ran on reliable triple-expansion steam engines, old school by design but simple to build and dependable. With a top speed of 11 knots, they were fast enough for convoy duty. Kaiser's worker training was just as efficient. His programs trained people for specific roles in about 2 weeks on average. Some learned spot welding in just 10 days. More complex jobs, like crane operation or ship fitting, took 4 to 6 weeks. That was a huge shift from traditional apprenticeships, where it could take 4 years to reach basic skill levels, and up to 10 years to become a master craftsman. The difference? Traditional shipyards taught everything. Kaiser trained workers to specialize, mastering one repeatable task they'd do hundreds of times. Despite concerns about speed and shortcuts, Liberty ships proved solid in combat. Out of the 2,710 built, around 200 were lost to enemy attacks, a 7.4% loss rate, which was actually better than average for merchant ships before the war. There were some structural issues. A few Liberty ships, 3 in total, broke in half due to brittle steel and welding flaws. That's just 0.11% of the total built. In total, around 1,500 cases of serious cracks were recorded, but total failures were rare. These issues led to better welding standards and tougher steel, and by 1944, the problem had been solved. In the end, the long-term performance of the ships proved the system worked. Liberty ships were only meant to last 5 years, just long enough to win the war. But many stuck around much longer. The SS John W. Brown, launched in 1942, is still afloat today in Baltimore as a museum, 82 years later. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, also built in 1942, made the trip back to Normandy under its own power for the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994. Another, the SS Hellas Liberty, is preserved in Greece as a museum ship. The careers of many Liberty ships didn't end with the war. Of the 2,510 that made it through, roughly 835 were still working in commercial service into the 1960s. Many were sold to other countries and remained in use into the 1970s. The last Liberty ship ever built was the SS Albert M. Bow, delivered on October 30th, 1945. It was never scrapped. In 1964, it sold for just over $65,000. A year later, it was converted into a floating fish cannery called the Star of Kodiak. Today, it's still around, landlocked, but serving as the headquarters of Trident Seafoods in Kodiak, Alaska. That makes it one of the last Liberty ships still standing. Over 80 years after it was built, the Liberty ship program didn't just change shipbuilding. It reshaped entire sectors of the American economy. The massive demand for steel pushed production to new heights, especially on the West Coast. To keep up, Kaiser built the Fontana Steel Mill in California. Finished in 1942, 5 months ahead of schedule, the plant produced around 700,000 tons of steel per year. It was the first time California had become a major player in steel manufacturing. Kaiser didn't stop there. His companies also built plants to produce magnesium, essential for incendiary bombs, and aluminum for aircraft. These operations supported a larger, integrated effort to power wartime production on every front. The ripple effects were felt in communities across California, Oregon, and Washington. In Richmond, California, the population exploded from about 23,000 in 1940 to over 100,000 by 1943, almost entirely due to jobs created by the shipyards. In Oregon, Kaiser built Vanport City to house workers. For a time, it became the state's second-largest city, with more than 40,000 residents, all tied to the shipbuilding effort or related industries. These fast-growing industrial towns were temporary, but they showed how focused investment could quickly transform entire regions. Another major legacy came from healthcare. With so many workers to care for, Kaiser teamed up with Dr. Sidney Garfield to offer prepaid medical coverage, a new concept at the time. That program evolved into what is now Kaiser Permanente, one of the country's largest healthcare providers. By the early 2000s, it was serving more than 12 million members. The model of affordable, preventive care that started in the shipyards ended up influencing healthcare systems across the country. The people who worked in those yards carried the experience with them long after the war ended. Many, especially women and minorities, got chances they never would have had in traditional career paths. The skills they learned helped open doors for future jobs, education, and opportunities that changed their lives permanently. The innovations developed for the Liberty Ship program didn't just stay in shipyards either. The welding techniques became standard in steel construction, oil refineries, and pressure vessel production. The prefabrication methods first used at Richmond spread to housing, bridges, and large industrial buildings. The bigger impact, though, might have been in how people thought about production. Concepts like parallel assembly, simplified design, and rapid worker training became core ideas in industrial engineering and operations management. In a 1985 study, Harvard Business School's Professor Michael Porter pointed to the Liberty ship effort as a key example of how quickly a country can build industrial strength when it's properly organized. At the start of World War II, the U.S. had limited merchant shipbuilding capacity. Within 2 years, it was building more shipping tonnage than the rest of the world combined. That shift proved something vital. Industrial capacity isn't a fixed number. It can be created and created fast when urgency, leadership, and innovation come together. The deeper message wasn't just about ships. It was about people and what they're capable of when given a chance. Before Kaiser, many industry leaders assumed there were hard limits to speed, skill, and production. Kaiser broke that mindset. He showed that challenging the usual assumptions could lead to results nobody thought were possible. The Liberty Ship program proved that everyday people, with focused training and real opportunity, could produce incredible results. Complex work that once took years could be done in weeks. Industries that had resisted change for centuries could be turned around in months. In the end, the ships themselves were important. But what they represented was even bigger. Proof that with the right approach, any system, no matter how traditional or complex, could be transformed. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who led the U.S. Pacific Fleet during World War II, later reflected on the war's outcome in his 1960 memoir. His message was clear. The war wasn't just won on the battlefield. It was won in the shipyards. He wrote that the U.S. fought its way across 5,000 miles of the Pacific, sustained by ships that were being built faster than the enemy could destroy them. Japanese planners believed American industry was strong, but limited. They thought if they sank enough ships, they could force the U.S. to the negotiating table. They didn't count on Henry Kaiser. By 1944, U.S. shipyards were replacing losses faster than the enemy could sink new vessels. As Nimitz put it, the math of attrition favored a side building 3 ships a day over the one sinking 2. In his words, it wasn't just military courage that decided the war, it was industrial power. Victories at sea and on Pacific islands were backed by victories in places like Richmond, Portland, and Baltimore. Kaiser's real achievement wasn't just the 1,490 ships his yards built. It was how he changed the mindset of entire industries. The launch of the Robert E. Peary, built in less than 5 days, stood as proof that long-held beliefs about how things had to be done could be wrong. That ship symbolized something bigger, a challenge to the idea that tradition always knows best, and a reminder that real progress means being willing to start from scratch. The same leaders who once dismissed Kaiser as an inexperienced outsider spent years after the war adopting the very techniques they'd once criticized. And the workers, many of them young, new to industry, and from backgrounds that had been shut out of skilled trades, took what they learned and helped build the post-war American economy. The methods developed under the pressure of war soon became standard practice in peacetime manufacturing across many sectors. What began as an emergency experiment became a lasting example of how real change happens, not just through talking about improvement, but by proving it can be done. This story isn't just about ships. It's about what happens when people are given the tools, support, and trust to rise to the challenge, and then exceed every expectation. Kaiser's workers weren't superheroes. They were everyday people who achieved incredible things because someone believed in them and built systems to help them succeed. That idea, tested and proven in the shipyards of Richmond, still matters today, especially in industries facing problems that seem too big or too complex to solve. Most of the Liberty ships are gone now, scrapped, sunk, or long retired, but their legacy lives on. You can still see it in every modern shipyard that uses modular construction, in factories that train workers to master key skills quickly rather than dragging out training for years, and in every manager who refuses to accept impossible as the final answer. That's what Henry Kaiser left behind, not just steel ships, but a new way of thinking about what's possible. From the moment he signed his first shipbuilding contract in December 1940, with zero experience, to the record-breaking launch of the Robert E. Peary in November 1942, to the final Liberty ship delivery in September 1945, Kaiser reshaped American industry. He didn't improve the system. He reimagined it. The 2,710 Liberty ships built between 1941 and 1945 didn't just carry cargo. They carried something far more powerful. Proof that when people are empowered by purpose and freed from outdated thinking, they can achieve what others thought was impossible.